Hey everyone, welcome back and buckle up because today's deep dive is going to take us far beyond the headlines. What we're watching right now on multiple continents isn't a series of random news stories or isolated flare-ups. It's something bigger. From the Black Sea to the Caribbean, from Ukraine's collapsing coastline to oil refineries in Texas and rising tensions across Asia, a seismic shift is underway in global power. The world that many thought was fixed, with Washington calling the shots and everyone else reacting, is cracking. New alliances are forming, old assumptions are falling apart, and the balance of strength between nations is changing right in front of us. So in this video, we're going to connect the dots. Why the conflict in Ukraine matters far beyond Europe. Why Venezuela suddenly sits at the center of a geopolitical storm. How China and Russia are challenging U.S. influence on two oceans at once, and why all of it signals the end of an era and the beginning of something fundamentally new. Get comfortable. This is the kind of story that reshapes the world map. Let's dive in. What is happening right now in Ukraine, in the Black Sea, and in the Caribbean is more than a collection of isolated crises. It looks increasingly like a stress test of the international order built around U.S. power. On unconnected maps, the ports of Odessa and Mykolaiv, the waters off Venezuela, the oil assets of Citgo in Texas, the islands between Taiwan and Japan, the same pattern appears. Washington presumes it can threaten, sanction, or project force with impunity, while rivals and regional powers probe how far that presumption really goes. On the Ukrainian front, the dynamic in the Black Sea has shifted. Moscow, according to this line of analysis, believes it has been remarkably restrained. Russian tankers and shadow fleet oil carriers have been attacked or sabotaged in international and third country waters. Yet, Russia has responded in a limited way, hitting specific targets linked to military cargoes while largely allowing civilian trade to continue. The patience, however, is not infinite. Vladimir Putin has now openly floated options that range from striking Ukrainian port infrastructure and vessels calling at Ukrainian harbors to a far more drastic measure, cutting Ukraine off from the sea altogether. From a Russian point of view, that last step is framed not as an escalation without cause, but as a response to what Moscow sees as hybrid attacks on its commercial lifelines. If Ukraine or its partners use civilian shipping as cover for military operations, then all shipping associated with Ukrainian ports becomes suspect. The logic is blunt. If Russia has full naval dominance, but still chooses not to sink every ship it can, it is exercising restraint. If that restraint is abused, it can be withdrawn. Those who support Russia take this further and argue that Ukraine has even given Moscow the pretext it needed to liberate Odessa and Mykolaiv, pushing Russia closer to the long-discussed scenario where Ukraine loses its coastline. And with it, any plausible deniability about who is launching seaborne drone attacks. That raises the wider question: how close is the world to a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO? Strictly speaking, neither Moscow nor Washington wants a formal war. But the commentator's perspective is that Western elites are unhinged enough to stumble into one. In this narrative, French, German, British, and other European leaders are portrayed as ideologically driven, prone to symbolic escalation, and less culturally connected to Russia than Ukrainians are. With Ukrainians, the argument goes, Russia shares history, language, religion, even surnames. With much of Europe, there is no such emotional break. Hence the warning. If a conflict ever broke out directly between Russia and NATO, Moscow would be far more ruthless than it has been in Ukraine, because it would no longer be fighting what it sees as a brotherly people, but a hostile bloc that has long worked to contain it. The Ukrainian theater, in this interpretation, remains an operation deliberately kept below the threshold of total war. Russia has not mobilized fully, has not shifted its entire economy onto a war footing, and has held back some of its most advanced weapons. Instead, it has used the conflict as a grinding war of attrition designed to wear down NATO's stockpiles, expose its economic vulnerabilities, and demonstrate that 30-plus supporting states still cannot match Russia's industrial and military output. The seizure of key logistics hubs like Krasnoyarsk in the west, known by its Ukrainian name, is presented as confirmation that Russia is consolidating an operational platform from which it can achieve the tasks of the special military operation at its own pace. Parallel to this, back-channel negotiations reportedly continue between Russian officials and U.S. representatives. The analysis is skeptical that Ukraine or NATO will produce a meaningful compromise. At most, the expectation is that Washington will eventually seek a face-saving exit once it accepts that Russia will not collapse, and that further escalation only deepens Ukraine's losses. The message is stark. Every additional month of fighting means more dead Ukrainians, more territory lost, and more money burned for a goal defeating Russia that has already failed. If the Ukrainian war exposes the limits of Western military and economic coercion in Eastern Europe, the standoff over Venezuela highlights similar constraints in the Western Hemisphere. The United States has long assumed that Latin America is its natural sphere of influence. Yet, despite sanctions, isolation efforts, psychological warfare, and the deployment of carrier strike groups, Caracas remains in place. The loud threats of ground operations against cartels in any country that sends drugs into the U.S. are read by the commentator less as concrete policy and more as tools of intimidation, signals to every government in the region that Washington reserves the right to cross their borders when it chooses, under the banner of counter-narcotics. But the critique cuts deeper. It points out that U.S. elites themselves have long tolerated or even exploited narco-trafficking, cutting deals with local actors, using the drug economy to launder money, fund covert operations, and keep parts of the domestic population politically sedated. In that light, the sudden moral panic about cocaine or fentanyl becomes less a genuine concern and more a flexible pretext for pressure. The release of figures tied to drug trafficking when it suits geopolitical needs, contrasted with harsh rhetoric about foreign narco-states, is cited as evidence of this double standard. At the same time, the United States is presented as a society in serious internal decay, a fraying social safety net, precarious health care, education burdened by debt, widespread addiction, high crime, and a sense of moral exhaustion. None of that, the argument insists, will be fixed by bombing speedboats in the Caribbean or threatening airstrikes on Latin American soil. On the contrary, external military adventures distract from the real task of cleaning the house at home and make it even harder to regain credibility abroad. The dispute over Citgo encapsulates another dimension of the struggle: economic warfare and asset seizure. Citgo, a U.S.-based refinery network ultimately owned by Venezuela's state oil company PDVSA, has effectively been expropriated through legal and financial maneuvers in U.S. courts. Supporters of Caracas argue that debts were rendered unpayable by prior U.S. confiscations of Venezuelan assets, then those same unpaid debts were invoked as justification to transfer control of Citgo to other claimants, with Venezuelan authorities excluded from defending their interests. Opposition figures recognized by Washington claim to speak for Venezuela in these proceedings, creating a system that critics call openly fraudulent. The response envisioned from Caracas is twofold. Legally, Venezuela refuses to recognize the forced sale and prepares countermeasures, including potential lawsuits and the targeting of opposition figures involved in the process. Strategically, the analysis suggests that Venezuela, or any state in a similar position, has options of its own. It can impose surcharges on oil exports to recoup the value of stolen assets, or it can mirror U.S. behavior by targeting American property or investments within its jurisdiction. The point here is less about specific policies and more about reciprocity. If Washington demonstrates that property rights are contingent on politics, other states may adopt the same standard. That leads naturally into the broader claim: the United States is no longer in a phase of expansion, but in one of contraction. Past campaigns in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, or Syria are seen by many as disasters. In this critique, however, They are reinterpreted as brutal but effective exercises of imperial power. What is different now, the commentator insists, is that new red lines are holding. Iran has endured U.S. and Israeli strikes and responded without regime change. Russia has taken the blow of sanctions and military pressure in Ukraine and turned it into a demonstration of resilience. If Venezuela also resists and survives, it could become a symbolically decisive moment, the place where Washington finally discovered it could not topple a government in its own backyard, despite maximum rhetorical pressure and the presence of carriers offshore. From this perspective, each of these theaters, Ukraine, the Middle East, the Caribbean, the Pacific, marks a point along the perimeter of a shrinking empire. Ukraine, especially, is treated as an inflection point. A war that was supposed to weaken Russia and discipline Europe has instead exposed NATO's limits and accelerated the drift toward a more multipolar world. Venezuela, in turn, is framed as a test of whether the U.S. can still impose regime change at will. If it fails, Latin America and other regions may feel emboldened to chart more autonomous courses. China's behavior is woven into this picture as well. Beijing has strategic and economic interests in Venezuela. It does not want its investments destroyed by a U.S. attack. At the same time, it faces its own disputes in East Asia. The recent confrontation around the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, where Chinese Coast Guard vessels challenged Japanese presence near contested waters, sends several messages at once. To Washington, it is a reminder that Chinese leverage in East Asia can be used if the U.S. insists on pressuring Chinese partners elsewhere to Tokyo and Taipei. It signals that Beijing is prepared to escalate around issues it considers core interests, especially if it sees U.S. policy as destabilizing. The analogy with Taiwan is explicit. Just as Russia claims a deep historical, cultural, and emotional tie to Ukraine, China sees Taiwan as part of its national identity in a way it simply does not see Japan. That asymmetry matters. A conflict over Taiwan would be fraught and emotionally charged. A confrontation with Japan could be much more brutally transactional. The underlying message is that great powers, when pushed, will not only defend what they view as their own territory or near abroad, but may also threaten U.S. allies more distant from their civilizational core if the strategic calculus demands it. Overlaying all this is the idea of psychological warfare. Flights of U.S. reconnaissance planes, tanker aircraft, or bombers visible on public tracking websites create waves of anxiety and speculation. Yet, as the analysis points out, truly serious strikes like past U.S. or Israeli operations against Iran are rarely telegraphed with transponders on and flight paths easily accessible to the public. They arrive unannounced in the middle of the night with stealth aircraft and cruise missiles invisible to casual observers. From this view, much of what circulates online about ominous movements is seen as either deliberate intimidation or click-driven fear-mongering, not real operational warning. At the same time, the commentator emphasizes that tension is not a game. The more Washington threatens Venezuela, Colombia, or other Latin American states, the more it risks provoking responses from leaders who refuse to be treated as subordinates. When figures like Colombia's president publicly push back, declaring that attacks on their sovereignty would be acts of war, and pointing out their own efforts against narco-trafficking, they chip away at the aura of inevitability around U.S. power. Those statements may not stop every pressure campaign, but they contribute to an emerging norm. Threats will be met with public resistance, not automatic deference. Against this turbulent backdrop, other actors, including the Vatican, occasionally call for dialogue, de-escalation, and economic rather than military pressure. These appeals, however imperfect or limited, reflect a recognition that ordinary populations, not presidents or generals, bear the brunt of sanctions, destabilization, and war. Still, the analysis is skeptical that moral exhortations alone can tame entrenched geopolitical habits. For decades, the U.S. Security establishment has reached first for coercive tools, sanctions, covert operations, military deployments. Shifting from that reflex to genuine respect for sovereignty and equality would require a deeper transformation of elite culture. The conclusion drawn from all of this is not especially comforting for Washington. From the perspective laid out here, the United States had a chance to lead the world by example, to become a model of prosperity, fairness, and peaceful cooperation that others would willingly emulate. Instead, it pursued dominance through force, financial leverage, and selective application of international law. That strategy worked for a time, but it produced profound resentment, empowered rival coalitions, and hollowed out the domestic foundations of its own society. Now, as it faces the cumulative effects of miscalculation in Ukraine, overreach in the Middle East, and resistance in places like Venezuela, the tools that once delivered quick victories are producing diminishing returns. Ukraine's battlefield realities, Iran's endurance, Russia's industrial mobilization, China's careful but firm signaling, and Venezuela's stubborn survival all point to the same underlying shift. The age of uncontested U.S. primacy is fading. What replaces it is still uncertain. It could be a more balanced multipolar order with negotiated spheres of influence and stricter respect for sovereignty. It could also be a more chaotic world of fragmented blocs and proxy conflicts. Much will depend on whether Washington, Moscow, Beijing, Brussels, and regional powers choose accommodation or escalation. In that sense, the crises described tankers in the Black Sea, refineries in Texas, submarines off the Caribbean, Coast Guard ships near disputed islands are not just episodes in a news cycle, they are signals of a system under strain, where the old rules no longer function and new ones have not yet been agreed. For observers, the challenge is to see past the propaganda of all sides and recognize the structural changes underway, the exhaustion of an imperial model, the rise of alternative centers of power, and the struggle of nations large and small to protect their sovereignty in a world where the balance of power is finally visibly shifting.